All right. Let's move on to part two, which are the angiosperms, the flowering plants. Real quick, I kept on saying endosperm. Sorry, I kept on saying endospore in the last part where I was referring to the nutritive material surrounding the embryo. That's actually endosperm. I don't know why I kept on saying that. It's late, but endosperm is the actual nutritive material coming from the. In the case of the gymnosperms, all this 1N nutritive material that supports the embryo as it's germinating from the female gametophyte. Endospores are bacterial spores, so completely unrelated. So just remember that. Okay, this should be pretty quick because we went over most of the big features of these seeded plants in the gymnosperm stuff. So it's gonna be pretty similar. Just a couple of features that I want to change up on you, which is number one, the gymnosperms have naked seeds, which means the ovule turns into seed, and whatever that resulting seed structure is basically falls in the ground and germinates, makes a new 2N sporophyte. In the case of the angiosperms, their ovules, which will turn to seeds, are contained in a structure called the ovary. This ovary, as it matures, is what turns into the fruit. So this ovary holds the ovules, which are the seeds. So you can imagine, right? If you look at like a cucumber or whatever, the fleshy material that is surrounding the seeds is what developed from the ovary. The ovules are the seeds in the inside. So the ovary would be the fruit, the seeds would be the ovules, or the mature ovules. Okay, so let's draw out your typical flower, right? And so this is the carpel, which consists of the stigma, the style, and the ovary. Inside the ovary, you have your ovules. Perfect. And now on the outside, you have your filaments and your anthers. Combined together makes the stamen. Then you have your petals on the outside and sepals and whatnot. But we're going to focus on the reproductive structure, so forget about the modified leaves here. Just look at the anther and all the parts of the carpel. So let's take the anther real quick. The anther, this multi-lobed structure, if you cut it open, you'll actually see it's got inside these lobes, they're full of, when they're immature, microsporocytes. So these are the mother cells for the male spores. So each one of these lobes then is actually a sporangium, or a microsporangium. And as this anther matures, what do we talk about? The sporocytes undergo meiosis, and almost exactly like the gymnosperms, you get these 4 resulting pollen grains that come from the microsporocyte. So actually you get 4 spores first that then meiose into 4 microgametophytes, which are pollen grains. And like the pollen grains in the gymnosperms, again you have 2 cells. You have the generative cells, and you have cell. There's only 1 cell in there, and you have the tube cell. Again, the tube cell will turn into the the pollen tube that goes and burrows into the ovary to hit the ovule to fertilize the egg inside the ovule. And that entire point is to make that tube, and then you shoot sperm through the tube. The sperm are made from the generative cells. I said earlier I was going to look up the location of the antheridia inside these pollen grains, right? The antheridia being the organ that makes the sperm cells. It makes and houses. The what I found out was they actually just consider this generative cell the antheridia, right? And why that is the generative cell eventually turns into sperm, and so this organ, I guess, if you want to call it that, is essentially this generative cell is what is making the sperm cells that will shoot through the tube cell eventually, or the tube that is made from the tube cells. And I guess you just consider that the antheridia. Okay, so this is all very similar to the gymnosperm life cycle in terms of making pollen. What is a little different is when we start, so I think it goes without saying then the anther is the male reproductive organ in the flower, and then we'll go on to the female reproductive organs, which are all revolved around this ovary. So before we get there, the pollen in the flowers, generally speaking, they aren't as, they're even less developed as separate entities or separate little plants than those of the pine cones and the pine trees. They don't have the Mickey Mouse ears. They don't have this because they're more reliant, or most flowers at least, are more reliant on animal to actually maneuver and take these pollen grains from one flower to the other. So instead of using the power of the wind for dispersal of pollen, they'll actually rely on animal pollinators. And the way they do that is, so at the base of their flowers have some sort of nectar, or somehow they'll get, we'll just use this nectar situation as an example, but somehow they entice some pollinator, in this case using some sugary substance at the base of their ovaries. You'll have your bee, is real happy, he'll come in and lick up all that sweet water. In the process, he brushes up against the anthers and he'll collect some pollen grains on him. He'll fly to a new plant, and then as he's scurrying around looking for that sugar water, some of the pollen on his body will make its way onto the top of the stigma, the landing pad on the stigma. And we'll get to what happens later. Let's just focus on the development of the female ovules. Okay, so looking at the ovules, each individual ovule kind of similar to the gymnosperms. Right, you got in the immature ovule, you have this megasporocyte. And it undergoes meiosis to make 4 megaspores, 3 of which abort, and then this remaining megaspore undergoes mitosis, and the gametophyte in this case looks a little different than the gametophyte in the gymnosperms, which are, as far as we know, just this one singular blob that has very, very similar haploid cells and an egg embedded at the bottom in the archegonia. Here you have the egg and a couple of other cells that you'll need to know the names of, but aren't really actually that important in terms of the scope of this class at least. You have the antipodal cells up top, 3 of them. You have 2 synergids down here. The egg and 2 polar nuclei. And so this entire structure is the female gametophyte, the megagametophyte. And I guess similar to the highly reduced archegonia or antheridia in the pollen grains, this egg, I guess, would just be considered the archegonia here. There's no special pouch for the egg. It's just laying inside the bottom of that female gametophyte, and that egg will develop into an eventual zygote. Okay, so going back up here, the pollen is now hit the top of that style. So that pollen, remember, you got the generative cell, you have the pollen tube. The pollen tube cell undergoes meiosis or mitosis, divides a bunch of times, and makes a pollen tube that goes in, and burrows into the ovule to get to the egg, which it will fertilize by shooting two sperm that are made from the generative cell that go into this tube that just got made. The reason you have one sperm fertilized the egg, so that egg was one N, sperm was one N, and you add those together and you make a 2N zygote. Another sperm goes and fertilizes the polar nuclei, and it makes 3N endosperm. So whereas the endosperm in the gymnosperms are just converted cells of the original female gametophyte that go from one end and stay one end, they just change structure, I guess. In this case, you actually get a 3N endosperm cell that rapidly divides and takes over the rest of this gametophytic chamber, and it all becomes 3N endosperm. Right, and the endosperm 3N comes from the two polar nuclei plus the 1N of the sperm that fertilizes it. So that's different. Other than that, so now you have this resulting structure, the ovule, which will become the seed. I guess at this point in time, it's almost a seed already. Where you have the embryo, which is 2N. You have the 3N endosperm. And this entire structure is encapsulated inside of an ovary. Now, that ovary then matures, changes structure, and becomes a fruit. And that fruit is simply that protective outer layer that holds all the mature seeds. And that outer ovary, that can take a bunch of different diverse shapes. It can be the fleshy kind that promotes ingestion by animals for dispersal. It can be just a hard shell for protection. Sometimes it can. There's if you look back at the fruit slides that I commented on in a previous email, you should be able to see all the huge diversity of these different fruits. And it's important to look at the structure of the fruit and kind of determine how and what their structure means in terms of how they disperse their seeds. I think that's pretty important, and it's worth classifying them in these very general groups. Remember, in most of those classifications, they aren't taxonomically relevant, so they're not all drupes are in this one taxonomic clade, for example, or not all the legumes are in one taxonomic clade. It's just more of a structural kind of thing. Other than that, I think the angiosperms, again, pretty similar. Just remember that the seeds aren't naked, and remember the structure of the flower and how it relates to pollination and the resulting distribution of the pollen from the anthers to other flowers further away by taking those pollen grains and putting them onto the stigma, either through there's multiple ways of doing this, but the way that we talked about was using a animal pollinator is attracted by nectar. All right, so I think I'm going to end this lecture here. Again, I think it was pretty short. Any more questions, email me.